Hello and welcome everybody. I'm Anthony Gonzalez and I'm the Senior Program Coordinator with the Higher Education Center. And I want to welcome you all today for our first webinar of the year titled Deaf and Hard of Hearing College Students and Alcohol Use, featuring Dr. Christine Gannon. Before we get started with today's session, I do just have a couple of housekeeping slides I'd like to share with everybody. Here on the screen should look somewhat familiar as we are in the Zoom webinar format. We do welcome your questions at any time throughout the live session, but we do kindly ask that you utilize the Q&A feature. We do have the chat enabled today, and we will be sharing resources throughout the chat, and feel free to engage and share reflections with any of the content and resources that are shared. But again, we do just kindly ask that you utilize the Q&A feature for any of those specific questions. We also encourage everybody to learn more about becoming a member of the Higher Education Center. You can learn more about the different membership tiers and the benefits that go along with them by visiting our website at hecaod.osu.edu. We also have a couple of upcoming events I'd like to share with everybody. We'll be continuing the conversation from today's webinar for our next water cooler chat. It will be titled A Conversation on Alcohol Use of Deaf and Hard of Hearing Students, and that will be taking place on February 11th and will be moderated by Dr. Gannon. And our next webinar will be taking place on February 20th and will be presented by Dr. Watkins, and we'll be focusing on examining the current landscape of substance use prevention, DEI, and the stigma in higher education. And with that, it is my great pleasure to turn it over to our presenter today. Our presenter today is Dr. Christine Gannon, Associate Professor at Gallaudet University. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Gannon, and it's my pleasure turning it over to you at this time.
And okay, awesome. All right, hello everyone, and thank you for joining for this workshop. I'm Dr. Christine Gannon, and want to thank the Higher Education Center for hosting this. Thank you to Anthony and Logan, and also to our interpreters, Allison and Mark. So thank you for joining us. So before I proceed, I want to acknowledge that I'm going to SimCom today, and generally in my world, in the deaf community, we don't tend to SimCom because it impacts the purity of the language. So if you're SimComming, you don't always have incredibly clear English or incredibly clear ASL because there's two different languages. I am going to go ahead and SimCom today because most of our people in this workshop today are hearing, so I want to be able to speak directly to the hearing people. Also want to be very inclusive of our deaf participants, and because I'm talking about deaf and hard of hearing experiences related with my study, I feel for the integrity of this conversation, I think it's really important to link it with the ASL. So my goals for today's workshop is want to take a look at what are similarities, what are differences between alcohol use for deaf and hard of hearing college students compared to hearing students. Also want to take a look at the impact of the experience of being isolated and communication barriers for deaf and hard of hearing and deaf blind students. So that's the deaf blind, and hard of hearing, DDBHH. Also want to take a look at what are things that hearing institutions that are institutions that are predominantly hearing, what they can do to be more inclusive for deaf, blind, and hard of hearing students. All right. So before we proceed, if you wouldn't mind posting in the chat who you are, where you're from, like what's your institution, and then that way we can get a sense of who's here. So please go ahead and do that. You can also add to your name, your institution. What kind of experience do you have working with deaf, blind, and hard of hearing students? So we can do the next slide. Awesome. So you could say no experience, some experience, and answer the poll. Thank you.
Yeah, I just launched the poll. We'll leave it up here for a few seconds, so we'll give people a chance to complete that. As we see the percentage get to above the 85% mark, we will start to wrap that up.
Awesome. Thanks, Logan.
We will wait 5 more seconds. So I'm going to share the results. They should pop up automatically on your screen. If they do not, please use the Zoom toolbar at the bottom of your screen and find the polls and quizzes button, and that should bring that up. This is the slide 9 poll, and we can see that we are majority of our audience is in the no and little experience category.
So, to give you a little bit of background on myself, I am the child of deaf adults. So, both my parents are deaf. So, I grew up in really both the hearing and the deaf world. I also grew up going to Gallaudet University because both my parents worked at Gallaudet. So, have a long history being involved in Gallaudet. When I decided to go to grad school, I decided to combine my personal experiences with my professional training and have been doing health education or related education since 1995. When I went to Gallaudet full time starting in 2011, I initially did a lot of student affairs work. So I was providing alcohol and cannabis screening, other drug interventions, and using basics, the brief alcohol screening and intervention for college students. Also used the core survey for the Southern Illinois University alcohol edu from Vector. And some of the things that we saw was that our students' use related with alcohol was not that much different than hearing students, but the impact of the use, the consequences seemed higher. And we kept on getting this information through the data that we collected through our one-on-one, but our core survey, also through alcohol edu. And I felt that in terms of doing that work, I was trying to figure out like why is the impact of our students' use more than hearing students. So I kept on offering this as an idea for a dissertation, and no one took it. And so I decided at one point to go back to school, and this became the theme for my dissertation. So I just want to acknowledge I got my PhD from Walden University, and my two chairs, Dr. Gibble and Dr. Evans, were really instrumental in being able to proceed and to support me with this dissertation. Also want to acknowledge and thank Gallaudet for letting me do this study at Gallaudet. So just a summary of the study. So I did a qualitative study for my dissertation, again for Walden. I looked at the perceptions and experiences of deafblind, hard of hearing students, but also staff. Again, it was all at Gallaudet. So for future studies, I'd like to engage deaf and hard of hearing students from other institutions. And we took a look at alcohol use and related harms and consequences. And I used the social ecological model as the theoretical framework for the study. So for a qualitative study, this was pretty large. I had 50 participants. My goal was not to be able to generalize, but I did really want to ensure that I had a large range of diversity within my participants. So Logan is going to post some of my notes in the chat, so you can just kind of see what the breakdown of was this. But 96% of my participants were deaf or hard of hearing themselves. Some of them were deaf blind, and some of them also were deaf plus other disabilities. The majority, well, really, the study was almost half-half staff and students. So it's 52% staff and the remainder students. Excuse me. For the students, it was 79% undergrad and then 35% 79% undergrad and then 35% mainstream. It's just a quick note what that means is, so 35% mainstream, it means that a student could have been the only deaf student in their high school growing up, or they could have been in a contained classroom within a hearing high school. All right, so that's what mainstream tends to mean. So I saw a range of use with their alcohol use. You know, we had students who said that they didn't use at all, and some of the participants were on their, to quote, sober journey. I had some students who didn't perceive themselves to be in recovery, but to not use. Students who had occasional use, students who partied, and then I had students who used every day. These are 3 different quotes from some of what the students said. You know, the top quote, "I just drink enough," was a kind of a good highlight on one of the limitations of the study, and something that I would change if I did it again, that I did not have any kind of rubric or tool to measure use. So I just drink enough. Well, what does that mean? And so that was something that kind of came up for us in this study. I had another student talk about drinking every day. I had students who said, you know, they knew a lot of deaf students who did not drink. So this perception that all deaf students drink is not true. Almost all of the participants acknowledged some kind of harm that they had seen or experienced. So the highest example of harm were physical fights, but there was examples of academic harms, physical harms, social harms, emotional harms, and that was pretty consistent with what the research says in general about hearing students related with harms. So 3 big themes came up with my research. So the first one was the college effect. So similar to hearing students, we see that when deaf and hard of hearing students get to college, their alcohol use tends to go up. All right, that's pretty consistent. And I'll explain a little bit more related with that. The second theme that was different than hearing students was the impact of communication barriers and isolation. And then the third were the social norms that came up, and that this is actually similar and different. And so we'll talk about that. Okay, so similar to hearing students, we saw the college effect, and the reasons for students using were pretty similar, and the reasons for not using were pretty similar. So for example, reasons for using was feeling like they wanted to be adult, or they wanted to use it for a social lubricant, or to kind of feel that social vibe, to have more fun and create memories, to feel less kind of inhibited. Right. And then the reasons for not using were pretty similar too. You know, when students who had goals and students who really were focused on their plans, whether they be a student athlete or wanting to establish a good GPA. There's also students who were on their sober journey in terms of the words that they chose to use. Some students also kind of saw it as kind of immature behavior or kid behavior. I'll give you a chance to read this quote. So this quote, I think, is connected to the college experience, wanting to kind of seize all the opportunities that students perceive can happen in college. But it's also a transition to the next theme with communication barriers and isolation. So yes, our students want to have the typical quote unquote college experience. Our students also, many of them comes from environments where they didn't have typical high school experiences because they were socially isolated or they had communication barriers. So one of the things that some of the students felt was that FOMO, or fear of missing or missing out, was greater with our students, and that transitions into the communication barriers and isolation. So communication barriers kind of connects with a lot of different aspects of what came up in this study. So first off, in family environments, about 30% of hearing parents of deaf children learn how to sign. There's sometimes also a spectrum of how much they signed, but what happened for a lot of deaf and hard of hearing students and families who hear was that they didn't have communication access in the family, and so, or they had limited communication access. That's also seen very much in society, so that being able to access communication or being able to join conversations, there was more barriers for that. That impacts alcohol education and messaging. So being able to learn healthy messaging related with alcohol, or for example, seeing Uncle Frank drinking and not really understanding what's going on and not being able to hear the conversations about that, or about conversations trying to get him to reduce or provide him support, or about how that's not really healthy behavior. There's this concept of incidental learning also, and I'll explain that in just a minute, but the information, being able to pick up information as they go. At Gallaudet, students arrive, and yes, they have the college effect, but they also have access to communication. And so this being able to fit in and to be able to join other people because their communication is available and there. Now, I do want to acknowledge that not all students come to Gallaudet with communication access. About 37% of our students are new signers. So I'll come back to that in a little bit, but being able to communicate, yes, but also just to be with people who are like me. Then there's also part of communication barriers is language deprivation. And I'll also come back to that in a minute. But language deprivation, there is a spectrum of it. So if you have complete language deprivation, it often can have impact on cognitive functioning. But if you have kind of limited language deprivation or kind of isolated language deprivation, that can have other kind of impacts as well. And then the last part of communication is just feeling lost, and this came up as part of my study, but it also just came up in class yesterday, about, being able to hear some, but not enough to be able to fully access a conversation, and people not really fully understanding that you can't hear to be able to fully engage, and then kind of assuming that you're hearing the information or being able to get all of that information, and it creates a lot of gaps, but also some conflicts in terms of relationships. And I'll expand on some of these more as we go. Okay, so how many of you have seen the term incidental learning before?
The poll should be up, so we will take about 20 additional seconds and have people answer the poll. And if it does not pop up, look at the bottom of your Zoom toolbar, and it should you should be able to click on it there. Okay, I'm going to end and then share the results. As we can see, the yes and no or about even, and then unsure is just over 21%.
Okay, great. So thank you for answering that poll. It was when I shared some of this information recently, I realized that the concept of incidental learning could be new for some people. So added some information here about incidental learning. And I think what's important to recognize is that if I can hear, I gain information just by overhearing conversations, by overhearing what my friends, my family, my parents are watching on TV, just by walking through groups of people, by sitting on the train and hearing what people in the other aisles in front of me are talking about, by hearing what people are listening to on Spotify. So I pick up information because I can hear it. And when I can't hear it, I lose that incidental incidental learning. And that impacts some of my access to information and some of my access to communication. There's a concept of what's called the dinner table syndrome, where, if you're a deaf or hard of hearing person and you're around the table and people are talking, it's really hard to follow a conversation. One of the students in the interviews talked about how one-on-one she's fine, one-on-two she's fine, but then once you have a whole group of people, then it's really difficult to kind of maintain the conversation, and it goes back to the concept of being lost. And you can see this quote here, that, a lot of things that we learn are not directly taught, they're caught. And that's the concept of incidental learning. So this next concept of language deprivation, I think that we often talk about language deprivation, in terms of complete deprivation, that child that was locked in the room that never had interactions, or that the child that did not have the opportunity to talk with people until they were 2 or 3. Well, that's definitely language deprivation, but there's also a spectrum of language deprivation that if I only have access to the basics, like my family only signs the basics, more, eat, come on, time, hurry up, then I don't have the same opportunity for critical conversations, for discussions, and it impacts my ability or my opportunity to be able to build those cognitive skills. It also impacts my social interactions, because if I have very limited social interactions that are very kind of basic conversations, then as a young person, I don't always have as many opportunities to build those social skills. And so then going into college and getting there and maybe not having a lot of social experience, then I might have to kind of pick up some of that information. And you see the quote here, that, communication helps us to understand the world, the rules, yourself. And if you have language deprivation, that can impact your whole experience. And I'll give you a chance to read that quote. So this quote is purposely overwhelming. Excuse me. It was actually much bigger, and I kind of whittled it down to some of the main points. But I know that this is breaking the rules of PowerPoint. And I know you're supposed to only have kind of bullets and stuff like that. But I wanted to leave this overwhelming because of the power of this quote. If you don't want to read the whole thing, you can read the purple, the lonely, isolated, the only kid, only deaf kid. People don't learn my language. They don't repeat themselves. They don't care if I'm included. I grew up isolated, without support. They don't want to take care of us. We're a burden. No one's looking out for me. And then I had the best time in my life. People who understand me. I'm not a burden anymore, and I can have fun and I can be cool too. So this quote captured a good chunk of the conversations I had with students and with staff. And I knew that students were isolated, and I knew that staff had experienced that themselves growing up. And I saw that also with my parents growing up. But I didn't anticipate the poignancy or the magnitude of the isolation. To be honest, that was something that was kind of like overwhelming for me. And so one of the reasons I wanted to kind of leave the potency of this quote so big is so that you could kind of get a sense of that too. That so many of our students, even for the students who were deaf of deaf, meaning they grew up in deaf families, still would feel isolated when they went out into the hearing world. So a lot of our community members, even if they were included in conversations, or even if they were had access to communication, just in the hearing world, often they experienced some communication barriers that would cause isolation. And then for the students who were the only one, they saw a lot more, or felt or experienced a lot more of that. Have you seen this? Have you seen this with your student populations, whether they're hearing, deaf, other groups?
I just launched the poll. Again, we will wait 20 more seconds and then I will share the results. I'm going to be ending the poll. And here are our results with overwhelming majority saying yes.
Yeah, so whether your students are deaf, hard of hearing, or hearing, and other populations. So we're seeing isolation, and we did see a lot of that and a rise of that with COVID. I think one of the things that was interesting about COVID was it really kind of highlighted the impact of isolation on mental health. In the deaf world, we've known that for a long time, and so it's nice to get the acknowledgement through COVID. At the same time, I think overall we need to be looking at this more. So I know what else I wanted to add. Sorry. So in terms of isolation, this is something 71% of you have seen isolation. So encourage you to join the water cooler chat, and this is something that we can talk about a little bit more and kind of looking at why we're seeing isolation and how does that impact and what do we do about that. I'll give you a chance to read this quote. Yeah, and I think it's important to recognize, you see isolation. It does not always impact alcohol and substance use. That was just something that, because the theme of my study was on alcohol, that's how it came up. But it's definitely possible that it could impact other aspects of life that are not related. Right, but related to that was that I also saw that some students were using alcohol to cope. That they had personal experiences that would help them. The alcohol would help them forget. That they would be feeling isolated in the home, and drinking or using alcohol would just improve that, just make it a little bit better. There was also some students just get a little bit overstimulated, so alcohol would help calm them. Or there was situations where students were reporting needing alcohol to help them fall asleep. Give you a chance to read this quote, and then I'll explain. So this is an example of a new signer that was part of our community. As I mentioned to you, 37% of our new students are new signers. And so we have students who get there who maybe have never been around other deaf people, or maybe they were the only ones who were deaf and hard of hearing, but they didn't learn sign language. So they would speak or read lips or use the cochlear implant or other technology. And for some of our students, when they get to Gallaudet, it might be a little bit disconcerting in learning to pick up signs. But as this person mentioned, that once they picked up, this was the first time they were really able to belong and feel like they were part of a community. So pretty similar. So the same concept of, before Gallaudet, I never had the chance to really kind of connect or be a part of a group. And now I get to Gallaudet and I belong. And so part of that is kind of maximizing that experience and using alcohol as a part of that. Give you a chance to read this one. So again, similar theme, individuals kind of feeling like they missed out on opportunities. So getting to Gallaudet and really wanting to seize the opportunity to really kind of get a lot of those experiences that they maybe felt like they missed in high school or younger, and really wanting to kind of catch up on life. I'll give you a chance to read this, and then I'll also explain. So this kind of transitions into the third theme, and want to acknowledge that a lot of our students are not socially isolated because they're around other deaf people, or not socially isolated in the school environment, maybe at home that's hearing and there's not communication access. It's a little bit of mixture of both. But one of the things that we see is that some of our students are very heavily socially networked. So meaning that if they go to a school for the deaf growing up, and if they play sports, or if they're on the academic bowl, which is like an event get together, or the battle of the books, that they might know people from all over. So for example, a different person was telling me that, before they even started as a freshman, they already were texting their friends from all over the United States, making a plan for a party for that first night and getting together. And so this participant's point was that, all these people are, texting and FaceTiming, wanting to kind of get together. And if there wasn't so much of that social opportunity, that maybe they wouldn't drink as much. Okay. So the kind of concept of high density deaf people, social opportunity, getting together and maximizing an experience, and using alcohol as a social lubricant. Right, which again transitions to this third theme of the social norms. So what we see is that, and in some school environments before Gallaudet, in school they're not allowed to drink, but maybe after school, maybe when the families get together to go camping, or when they get together for an event or something, that parents might let them use alcohol. So that kind of sets up some alcohol use and behavior before getting to Gallaudet. The other thing that happens sometimes with smaller groups is that we have a high number of alumni. So for example, in my study, I mentioned to you that 26% were staff. Well, of those 26%, I think it was like 86% were alumni of Gallaudet. So that means that their stories, their experience kind of get handed down. Well, that's also true for families who are deaf and other alumni. It's also true, for example, students who are friends with let's say they graduate and they come to Gallaudet, and then their friends are still in high school, and they're posting on social media and talking about all these great things they're doing and showing they have alcohol involved, but not showing, the hangovers or the getting sick or the negative impacts. And because we have a high number of alumni, telling stories about these great times, these glory days. And then younger students seeing that and thinking, oh, when I go to Gallaudet, that's going to be my turn. I got to keep that going. And because alumni think, oh, I had glory days too, not really kind of seeing that and thinking more critically about what is happening, and thinking about, well, maybe we should encourage them to use a little bit less, or to be more careful, and just kind of normalizing that behavior and thinking that's okay. Did we skip one? Can we go back? Okay, perfect. Okay, so those were those three themes that we saw primarily. So it was the college effect, the communication barriers and isolation, and then also the social norms, which also kind of connects with expectancies related with alcohol use. How does this connect with the literature? Well, it connects with the hearing literature a lot, like in terms of like all, especially with the college effect and then expectancies and social norms. We also see connections with the research related with deaf and hard of hearing. So one of the things that we see is that when there are higher numbers of deaf people, there tends to be, or higher numbers of deaf people in a social environment, there does tend to be more alcohol use. So even though kind of overall, the numbers are pretty similar to hearing and deaf, it's when there's a high number in one place and it's a social environment, you'll see more alcohol use. We also see that when alcohol is used for coping, it tends to be more risky. So that can kind of connect with some of the riskier and the riskier use and the more harms. One of the interesting things is that we see a lot of research on language deprivation, and we see the language deprivation and the impact on health, but there's not a lot of information on the impact of language deprivation related with alcohol or substance use. So this is an area where there needs to be more research and kind of looking at the full spectrum of language deprivation and how that impacts many aspects of health, including substance use. All right, and related to that, we also know that adverse childhood experiences has an impact on alcohol use and other substances, but we don't explore communication barriers as an adverse childhood experience. So for example, if you have a child who's in a hearing family where no one signs, they have no access to communication, I would argue that that is an adverse childhood experience, but it's not on that list. And we don't really kind of look at how that impacts that child's health as they grow up and how that impacts their alcohol or other substance use, also their mental health too. There's also research that shows, that sometimes when deaf and hard of hearing youth are very isolated, that, when they get to other environments, they want to catch up, right? I don't think that that's kind of a big surprise there, but we don't always think about that. And those networks, impact social norms. The other thing that's kind of connected more with the hearing research is the research that shows that if I'm in a group where I feel like I know everybody and I feel safe, that actually sometimes you see more risky behavior. So we see that also with the deaf community. Yeah, so somebody in the comments talks about the adverse childhood communication environment, right? And so I think that's one study that we've seen, and there needs to be more included. And I'm also talking about Folletti's study, which I know is old now, but that we need to really kind of not have these be separated, that when we're talking about adverse childhood experiences, that we include adverse childhood communication environments in that and not have this be a separate concept. So it's great to see that there's a study, and that's definitely an area where there's more opportunity to be able to look at how communication barriers can be connected with those adverse childhood experiences. So my recommendations within Gallaudet is to look at the communication isolation, look at the impact of an alcohol. I would also, this was very specifically on alcohol, but we're also going to be taking a look at cannabis use and other substances. Also looking at different populations. One of the challenges is that, with the deaf world being kind of small, then when you have LGBTQ or BIPOC or other populations, it starts getting really small, but the experiences are not the same. So it is important to recognize those different experiences. And then I'm also going to talk about deaf and deafblind and deaf hard of hearing students at hearing institutions and what that experience looks like. In terms of education and intervention, we know that a lot of the strategies that are work for hearing in the hearing world also work in the deaf world. The key there is language access and being able to connect with the person who's giving that service. So for example, if you're doing brief alcohol screening, to be able to communicate with that person or to be able to fully understand. I would also recommend finding other ways to screen, for example, at doctor's appointments, student health services, but really kind of looking at how communication and isolation impact the social environment and providing more support for that. So that's at Gallaudet. I'd also like to talk about at like predominantly hearing institutions. So one thing to recognize is that at Gallaudet, the majority of our students, staff, faculty, we communicate in ASL. That's not true at many other spaces. And for for deaf and hard of hearing students who are at hearing institutions, they may read lips, they might be hard of hearing and can hear, or use hearing technology to be able to have them have access. So they might not be signers, or they might use a different kind of sign language. Okay, so for these individuals, or for predominantly hearing institutions, my recommendations look a little bit differently. So first, we really need to ensure that we are providing full accommodations. So that includes quality closed captioning. And I have to put that quality there because I've seen a lot of closed captioning. And if we rely on technology itself to do the closed captioning, it often gets messed up. So that when we develop and create materials and resources to ensure that the closed captioning is of high quality. And most of the time it means we have to kind of do it ourselves or double check that it's good. Also, high quality interpreting. Right now with political shifts, we're seeing some impacts to interpreting. So really advocating to ensure that all of our populations have access to interpreting. Now, a quick note back to the closed captioning is that having good quality closed captioning benefits everybody, because if you're in a space or you're in a place where you can't fully hear or you're not sure what was said, that closed captioning benefits all. So for us to be able to put a lot into quality closed captioning really is a win-win. Looking at inclusivity, like how do we ensure that our college students all have access to all aspects of the college experience? All right. So, and that kind of ties into the next column about looking academic access, the whole college experience, support services, including prevention, counseling, recovery services, and how do we look at that? And then also just raising awareness of deaf, blind, hard of hearing, opportunities to learn ASL, but also recognizing that you take one ASL 1 class does not mean you can be interpreting for other students, but just be aware of, that deaf, DEAF is not the same thing as deaf, or that yes, deaf people can drive, or just basic awareness of what it means to be deaf and what that experience is like. So that way you're more welcoming. The other thing that I think is really important for us as college professionals is that we're teaching our students to be the future professionals of America. So for us to find ways to weave into our curriculum, how do you be more inclusive of deaf, blind, hard of hearing, other people with disabilities, so that if I'm a social worker or if I'm a business professional or I'm a teacher, how do I ensure that my customer service to all is of high quality? And again, like looking at the different aspects of college life. So I saw that some of you are recovery professionals. Well, one of the challenges is trying to figure out in the other time, how do I ensure that all of my consumers can engage, can connect with people, because we might not be able to afford to have an interpreter 100% of the time. Building in opportunities to support mental health and resiliency. So sharing stories with our students, sharing learning and places where we kind of fell down and figured out how to get up, and having those conversations and talking about how we cope and how we build that resiliency. And then just lessons on healthy coping in general. Now, these points benefit deaf and hard of hearing students, but they also benefit all our community, and just in terms of building mental well-being. So how do we do this? So using technology. So technology is great, but again, like if you're using technology for closed captioning ensure that it's clear. There's a lot of really fabulous technology right now with FaceTime, using our phones to kind of connect through interpreters, using our phones to speak and then having captioning there. You can use the video relay interpreters using video phones themselves. We can partner with so many organizations. That's one of the great things that came out of COVID, was seeing these national resources. Again, related with recovery, there's a lot of recovery support now nationally that you can access on the internet. So that's an opportunity for providing support. So one example of that is deafaa.org. In terms of figuring out how do we ensure that our institution as a whole is inclusive, we can work with organizations like the National Association for the Deaf. Gallaudet University has resources. There's also ASL websites where you can learn. There's just a lot of really wonderful information. Okay. So that's kind of the dissertation and the study in a nutshell. One of my next steps is kind of looking at other related issues, and that's to come. But for right now, I'd like to turn it over to you and see what questions you have. I also have links to my study, and then also I have a list of references which will be included in the slides, so please take a look at those. We'll take a few minutes for some questions, and then I have a couple of discussion points too.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gannon. That was absolutely fantastic. Hope you see just the number of comments in here. We haven't even gotten to the questions yet. So at this time, if you do have questions, please put them in the Q&A so that we can get to them. As you're filling them out, if we get a robust number of questions, just want to let you know we only have 15 minutes. So no promises that we're going to get to them all. I had one to get us started off, Dr. Gannon. I had the privilege in COVID to spend time in my home state of Kentucky. So you were talking about the good things that come from Kentucky. One of the neat pieces that I saw was in the daily updates with the best governor in the country, Dr. Andy Beshear, is that they normalized having an interpreter and celebrated her. And so the question I have is, how do we build off that in then increasing the norm of accessibility? And what did you kind of learn in your study that might go along with that?
Yeah. So I agree. I think that was one of the really wonderful things through COVID. Sadly, we've been hearing things about them wanting to cut some of those services. So one thing, just as an aside, is that we need to push to maintain those services right now, even though there's political shifts, that having an interpreter on the stage is not a distraction, that is inclusivity and is beneficial for all people, So I'm sorry, Logan, what can you get to the part of the question again?
Yeah, it's how do we, I think you're starting on that with, we can't have the norm without funding, but how do we push for that to be a realistic norm and something people expect to be part of reality?
So I think the first thing is just being aware of this, recognizing we're seeing the interpreters on the stage. One of the things that we can do as college professionals that's very simple is to partner with our Office of Students with Disabilities and know what kind of services they have, know how to access their services so that way we know how to connect if we get an ask. The other thing that we can do to kind of show that we're supportive of these kinds of things is that on our flyers, on our materials, on our content, put a disclaimer, if you need accommodations, really of any kind, if you need language access or just any kind of accommodations, please contact us and give that contact information. So that's automatically normalizing it and showing that we are willing and receptive to including those kinds of services. And because we're already networked with OSWD or our Office of Student with Disabilities, then we know how to provide interpreting services. I don't think that we always need to provide interpreting services unless we can afford it, because it is very expensive. But for us to put that to advertise, then that's great. Now, if we can afford it, then it's awesome to provide interpreters. And if we can, if we're in a space where we can allot that budget and always have interpreting there, then that's even better. I mean, that's fabulous. I just acknowledge that it's not always possible for all institutions.
Absolutely. I think that makes a lot of sense. I think availability and knowledge. Absolutely. I love that you reframed that. Next question I want to highlight here is research about substance use disorders. I think this person is specifically asking around alcohol. Or just general alcohol use in the general deaf and hard of hearing population, not just specifically hard of hearing college students. What research are you aware of that is available around that topic?
Yeah. So there's not a lot, but there is some. And if you look at the references that I included, you can access some of the information that are from other studies. We know that alcohol use tends to be higher with higher density of deaf and hard of hearing people. We also know that the rates of alcohol use are higher with males, which is pretty similar to hearing populations. Also, senior males, so older males, retired males, tends to be higher. And the data on whether the general population of deaf and hard of hearing people use more alcohol is kind of mixed. I mean, it looks like you have some that shows a little bit higher, some a little bit lower. So based on that, I would say it's kind of pretty similar. But one of the things that we see is when people use heavily or maybe have an addiction or a problem with alcohol, then it tends to be more severe. Right. And I would say that probably the severity is also impacted by the access to services. So that if you go to for recovery services, it's harder to get services for deaf and hard of hearing people. You might be able to get that meeting interpreted, but then like all the other things, it's harder to get access to interpreting or closed captioning. We are looking at publishing a chapter, taking a look at alcohol and substance use in the deaf world in general. And there are some articles that could give that information, and I would encourage you to take a look at my reference list. Also would welcome any of you, if you have questions or want to talk about this, again, to come to the water cooler chat. We can talk about it more there, but then also you're welcome to contact me.
Absolutely. And that water cooler chat that Dr. Gannon mentioned is going to be happening on February the 11th at 2 o'clock Eastern time. And it'll be a more informal, it'll be set up as a meeting rather than a webinar, and it'll have lots of discussion happening and not as much presentation. So more conversation on the topic. Our next question, Dr. Gannon, is around prevention resources for the deaf and hard of hearing community. I'm going to think specifically college students, but there are other ones, but like what resources do you know of that are available for working with this specific population?
So specific for deaf and hard of hearing, there's not a lot. I think that there's one program that's designed for high school students that is based in ASL, but I think it is possible to use hearing-based resources for the deaf world for high school, college students. I think it's just important to recognize any accommodations that need to happen. So for example, a lot of the online platforms they have videos, resources, text. So for those videos, ensuring and double checking that the closed captioning is effective. I also think that if you're using a platform that has a lot of text, for this generation, a lot of text might not be the best fit. So picking platforms that are have a lot of mixed methodologies, so that way they're more engaged. Now that benefits deaf and hard of hearing, but it also really benefits this generation, really anyone probably, in terms of making it more inclusive or engaging is a better word. I know that we worked with eCheckup to Go, and we were able to have them include some ASL videos with some of their content. I don't know if they share those ASL videos with institutions in general, but if you liked that idea, you probably could contact eCheckup to Go and see if they could include those ASL videos with your content if you used them. I know that we tried to get ASL videos with Alcohol EDU, but there was just problems with the platform because of the way that it was set up. Um, and I would say that, if there's any platform, like, for example, if you had a prevention education platform that you used that you wanted to build in ASL or captioning. I mean, the captioning you can do very easily, but you could also work with your students or contact Valuedet to see about having people kind of make the videos in ASL and then to be able to post them kind of in tandem with your other content. The only thing, again, I would just emphasize, and I know I said this before, that there is sometimes a perception that, oh, I took ASL 1 or 2 and now I'm fluent in ASL, and that's not true. So the only thing I would put out there to you is that if you are looking to develop resources in ASL or looking to have interpreters, just ensure that they are of high quality and know how to really be fluent in ASL or in the services that they are offering, and not just somebody who's really trying to be nice, which is great, but not offering great services.
Absolutely. I have a couple questions that I want to get to before we land. First one is going to follow up on that. This person said that in their area, they're learning that a majority of deaf and hard hearing youth, they don't necessarily read English like closed captions, just brief words. Any thoughts on how you might be able to address that when it comes to providing meaningful accommodations?
So that's true that and again, this goes back to language deprivation. So if, for example, you do not learn any language until you're 2 or 3, that's going to impact your ability to fully access language as you get older. So, and some kids they don't learn language until they're 4 or 5, or I had students who came from other countries and didn't have access to full language until they were 10, 11, 12. So that's going to impact their ability to access ASL and but also English, and also in terms of their cognitive formation. So yes, so within the deaf world, we do have people who may not fully be able to access English. So closed captioning is not a good fit. So then again, kind of going back to that ASL. So that's one of the reasons why saying closed captioning, that's the solution, is not the solution for all deaf and hard of hearing people. That many deaf and hard of hearing people are able to access the language, able to understand and fully kind of connect with the information when they have full access to ASL. So closed captioning is a wonderful resource. It's better and best if we are able to include ASL.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that reminder. I think we have to think about full picture and not just a basic rubber stamp. We did another question come in, so I want to see if we can get these final two before we wrap up. This next one that I want to ask is about this campus or organization is wanting to educate and provide services around fentanyl and Narcan or naloxone. Have you seen any social media campaigns or resources that have been used to educate the deaf and hard of hearing community or communities specifically around fentanyl and naloxone or Narcan?
So I have not, but I'm sure there are resources. I just have not looked recently, just kind of in terms of my other projects. But I would say that YouTube has some really great resources, and I'm sure that there probably is some information. At the same time, sometimes getting that information in ASL is sometimes kind of lags. So unfortunately, I can't share any resources with you related with that. But I think that it would definitely be worth looking and seeing what we could find. And I'd be happy to do that and sharing that with On the Water cooler chat or through an email. I also see in the chat that someone offers, there's a couple of resources that are available there. Yes, and I neglected to include NTID and resources there. There's a substance abuse service at NTID that has some resources, and there's another link there that people could kind of take a look at as well.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for drawing attention to that, Susan. Thank you for sharing out of Rochester Institute of Technology, the National Technical Institute for the Deaf. Looks like fantastic resources. And then I also shared the SAFE Projects website. They're a great partner of the Higher Education Center. So they do a lot of work in the opiate overdose space, including fentanyl and Narcan education. And then so they might be aware of something that is happening in that spot as well. Last question is, have you ever done a focus on deaf and hard of hearing belonging on colleges, primary hearing institutions or predominantly hearing institutions that can help push programming for inclusivity?
So I have not, but I love that idea. I mentioned kind of presenting recently. So I was at NASPA recently and had a couple of hard of hearing people there, and just kind of that idea, something similar sparked for me in terms of taking a look at what it's like for a deaf and hard of hearing person at a predominantly hearing institution. How does that impact alcohol use? We could also look at other substances. We could also look at other aspects of health, mental health, belonging, isolations, so that is kind of, I think one of the things that's great about doing research is all of the ideas, the list of ideas that come up for other studies. So I think that would be a great study. If you were able to do it, go for it. If not, maybe we could partner or something. We could put it on that list to do in the future.
Awesome. Well, we are out of time. And Dr. Gannon, I hope you are seeing the love and praise that you are getting on the chat. And if we were in person, you definitely would be getting a lot of applause. So thank you so very much for sharing of yourself, because I know this is a very personal journey for you. So thank you for the work that you're doing and sharing that. So thank you so very much. I would love for people to connect with the center. If you want to visit us on our website, it's hecaod.osu.edu. And again, that water cooler chat is happening on February the 11th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. Thank you so very much for your time and attention, everyone. We hope to see you next time, and take care.
Thank you.